Thank you to Bruce, Brad, Maureen, and Garrett. As Garrett mentioned, we're going to follow on that conversation with a related conversation on artificial intelligence, autonomy, and the ethics of each of those. So we're very excited to have three experts in the field to help walk us through that. Raman Chowdhury of Accenture, Brendan McCord of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center at the Department of Defense, Candace Worley of McAfee, and the conversation will be moderated by Kevin McLaughlin of The Information. So if you wouldn't mind, please welcome our next panel.
Great, all right. Well, my name is Kevin McLaughlin. I'm a reporter at The Information, which is a technology news website based in San Francisco. I cover artificial intelligence. And before we kick things off, I just want to say how glad I was to see that I had been assigned this panel, because it is an extremely fascinating topic, I think, for me and for many of my colleagues across the industry. The issues this year where employees in companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon and many others have started questioning or paying more attention to how the artificial intelligence products they develop are being used and who are the people using them has filled many pages for us and many other media outlets. So I guess the first thing I'd like to do is if we could just each introduce yourselves and your companies and your roles, and then we'll kick things off into the broader discussion.
Great. I'm Candace Worley. I'm Chief Technical Strategist for McAfee. I spend the lion's share of my time engaging with our customers to understand kind of what their challenges are, how they'd like them to be solved, what's not solved, where they need the industry to go as a whole in terms of product development, and then spend time with our engineering groups influencing the direction we take our product and solution strategies along the lines of what customers have asked for.
I'm Dr. Raman Chowdhury. I'm the Global Lead for Responsible AI at Accenture. So I create a consulting practice around creating ethical artificial intelligence solutions to bring to all of our clients.
And I'm Brendan McCord, the Chief Architect of the new Department of Defense Joint AI Center, which is an organization that was set up to accelerate the adoption of AI for critical defense missions. I'm also the head of machine learning at the Defense Innovation Unit, which applies commercial technology to important national security challenges.
So I think what's interesting about the debate that has unfolded within tech companies this year is that it has been focused on specific projects such as the Project Maven for the Department of Defense. And it's also extended to entire industries such as cloud computing and whether companies should be selling basic storage and computing and AI to the military. And so if each of you could just kind of talk about your take on that debate, and more specifically, is there anything missing from the general conversation and perceptions that are out there on this topic?
Sure, so I can start, and thank you very much. So I fly each week from my home in San Francisco to the Pentagon. And so I experience these sort of two different contexts on a weekly basis. And I can share my personal views on this issue. I'll start with ethics in keeping with the theme of the panel, but I'll add the caveat that I think this is primarily not an issue of substantive ethics. So for background, the mission of the Department of Defense is to keep the peace. It's to protect our country and deter war, and ultimately to protect that set of values that came out of the Enlightenment. Science, reason, humanism, progress, things that maximize human flourishing. And armed forces like those of the United States, their role in deterrence and offense and defense, these are features of the world and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. Armies of lawful democratic nations that are held accountable can be, I think, very positive influences on those terminal values of protecting human rights and stability. And the use of modern technology, in this case, advances in information technology, or in particular, the constellation of techniques we call AI, these are both inevitable and also, I think, instrumental steps towards achieving those terminal goals. So I started by saying that I don't think this is primarily about ethics, and I'll acknowledge that there's a multiplicity of views on ethics. Everything in Silicon Valley, from Kantian deontologists to consequentialist utilitarians, from anti-war pacifists to those who may be in military reserves and working at places like Google. And I think if this requires us to solve ethics, then we're screwed. So I would instead like to frame this a little bit differently and say that a critical thing that's missing is that we haven't built the infrastructure to have this conversation, to work through these challenges together. And so absent that, it's based on employees' interpretations of the world and reactions to the political context, and in some cases, a deep sense of mistrust. So the alternate framing that I'd like to offer for this is that of a coordination challenge. Instead of ethics, sort of think game theoretically about finding a focal point where we can coordinate together to try to solve, to try to work constructively and to try to maximize upside as a society while minimizing downside. I think the benefits for the tech community are that they'll gain more information about, more context about risks, and the chances that things they care about will be incorporated into these kinds of serious matters, that will be increased. So I think I would just urge that, constructively working across policy and technology and with ethicists and affected communities and lawyers and social scientists on these kinds of issues, that feels very important, and I don't foresee a scenario in which tech companies opting out will lead to us realizing the benefits or minimizing downside risk.
So I have two thoughts on this. First, I absolutely agree with you on this concept of basically governance. And it's a lot of what I build at clients. Often clients come to me thinking they want a technical solution for understanding the ethical use of technology or the implications of AI, and quickly realize actually this is an issue of governance. I'm in absolute agreement with you on that. But I wouldn't shy away from calling it an ethics issue. There are ethical considerations. So you think about specifically things like Project Maven and some of the talk about creating, for example, algorithms with that drive drones, and these drones are able to identify targets. Now, there is something to be said about what happens when we remove a human being from that decision making. That is a philosophical, ethical question. We see it today when people think about children playing war-like video games, Gears of War, et cetera, and how desensitized they become to just seeing an image of somebody being shot versus that being a very real thing. And then we think about that being applied to a global landscape where there isn't an equality of who has the resources to create said drones that might be able to identify a target, and it being used in nations in which it's not going to be an equal playing field. So there is an ethical discussion to be had, but I do agree the concept of governance is very, very important, and I think that a lot of people are reacting in a way that is more responding to a lack of feeling disenfranchised from the process. But there is an ethical discussion to be had about what is to be made and who's deciding what's being made and how it's being used.
And if I could just respond briefly to that, I agree that there is ethical content here. My statement was more intended to sketch what I think is at the crux of this issue, this divide here. But I would also offer that as a way forward, proactively aligning on a shared set of reasonable concerns and positive directions forward, which would include things like shrinking of the decision timelines and removing time for human reflection and these sorts of things. An example of this is DoD 3009, which is a memo in 2012 that frames this issue, and it tries to minimize the probability and consequence of autonomous or semi-autonomous actions and make sure that you have meaningful human control, meaningful testing. We've also recently announced a defense AI principles activity to try to engage folks and remove that feeling of disenfranchisement, and also incorporate those views and the good intuitions of the tech companies on these matters.
Yeah, and I'd add that there is no easy answer for that. I mean, in my world, everybody talks about human-centric AI. Nobody really knows what that means. So even as we build, you know, if we take this conversation away from defense, even just regular AI solutions, we say we want it to be human-centric. For example, think about AI in hiring. What does that actually look like? That's something that we haven't actually solved. So it's really, sometimes it's just turtles all the way down with this stuff, where we start asking these very fundamental philosophical questions. What does it mean to have meaningful human interaction with an artificial intelligence? So I completely appreciate the difficulty.
Yeah. So at lunch, we had the lunch breakout with David Sanger, and I'm going to quote something he said, which is, democracy is messy. And as we contemplate this question about, you know, the ethics around how we use AI, how we employ it for whatever purpose, especially in, you know, the context that you're referencing, Brendan, I think we would all like to live in a world where we never have to make a trade-off against our values. And the reality is that we may, in fact, have to contemplate making a trade-off against our values to secure the very thing upon which our values is based, which is our democracy. And so I think finding that framework, that center point where there are things that the government needs and things that the industry can wrap their head around giving a little on, and finding that middle point is going to be critical for us, because the reality is those against which we're building AI solutions to protect ourselves don't have this problem. There is no question in China or Russia about whether or not industry will share information with government. They will. Those are the people that we're defending our country against. And so if we're not contemplating how to find that balance, we will be at a significant disadvantage relative to those other countries and players that we're trying to defend against.
But I'd add that we're trying to find a balance.
Yeah.
In some of the places that you've mentioned, there is no balance. And it is a state enforced. It is a place where most of us would not feel like we have then defended our democracy.
I'm not advocating we behave like them. That was definitely not what I said, so let me be clear if there was any misunderstanding. I do think we have to seek balance here. I mean, balance is what democracy is about. It's about having different opinions. It's about finding some form of middle ground where we can hopefully maybe not have the perfect solution, but have a solution that works for the lion's share of citizenry.
And doing this in the context, as you said, of an open democracy and a market capitalist system in a way that lets us wrestle with the problem tomorrow with more information and without jeopardizing our security, that I think it feels like a tremendously important project.
Agreed.
I think it's interesting to look at why the debate is happening now, because AI has been around for a while, drones have been around for a while. These aren't entirely new concepts. Granted, maybe some of the people and some of the companies didn't realize the connections and how it was being sold, but this is an opinion question. I mean, why do you think now is the time for this discussion?
I think it's now because we're reaching a point in which the technology has evolved to a point where machines may be able to, will be able to organically evolve their algorithms in a way that they can start to make decisions independent of human input. And I think if you look at some of the early machine learning capabilities we had, they really did require some form of human oversight. If we're going to evolve to a point of leveraging things like deep learning, where the algorithms organically evolve and we can't tell why it came to the conclusion it came to, that becomes scary for a lot of people, and it probably should become scary, right? We need to begin to build into those systems the ability to understand what path it took to the logical outcome. But I think that's the change, is people now recognize these machines may come to conclusions that we're incapable of understanding how they got there.
I think there's also an infrastructure discussion to be had here, right? What's the difference between the iPhone and the Newton? Part of it was that we had the infrastructure, right? We had the capability of the World Wide Web. People understood how to communicate via this device, right? So there is something to be said about the fact that this all is happening together. IoT, is an example. Us being more open to technology, there being more digital natives or people who are comfortable working with technology or interacting on a computer. We're not teaching people to work on a computer anymore. That's just sort of part and parcel of being in a functioning society today. All of this is part of why artificial intelligence is really taking off. We as humanity or as a society, at least in the US, are more willing to understand its potential. So we have to be there ourselves.
I think part of why now is that it works. It's for an ever-widening space of problems. Machine learning, for example, is the best or only tool to solve these problems. And so above a certain usability threshold in our market economy means it drives revenue, which fuels back into research, and there's this virtuous cycle that continues. And so I think it's very meaningful. I think we're past a place of sort of BS around AI issues. And to the point of the prior discussion, we do have state-level actors moving billions of dollars into this area and planning the next century and thinking that AI is very important to this. And so the timeline we're on to start to have good ideas to address it is shorter than ever before. And so this is essential that we have constructive dialogue and start to figure this out.
Candace, you touched on a really important point that I wanted to focus on, and that is this idea of AI explainability, or the fact that with neural networks, you can't really back out and see how they arrive at the decisions that they make. This feels like a really big near-term challenge that, if solved, could help build trust in AI and perhaps, mitigate some of the misunderstandings that are out there. Your thoughts?
Go ahead, please.
He called you, so.
No, all of your thoughts.
There's certainly a lot, there's already work being done on that. So as people are evolving the AI technology, they're beginning to think about how do we build into that AI tech the ability to actually have it report out, for lack of a better term, the process and the logic that it used to come to its conclusion. And so, at least in the short term, I think that's how we're going to have to solve that. But
explainability is a really interesting thing. So I'm a data scientist by background, and I think what people in my community mean when we say explainability is actually not what people are seeking for. People are seeking understanding. You don't want to know what the activation function was in the node that led X to happen. That's actually irrelevant information. And what's very interesting is even if we were able to, quote, unpack the black box, it would not be information that is of use to most people. And there's really two things that I talk about in the practice that I'm building. Number one, it's understanding as opposed to explainability. So it's not just, and even understandable machine learning models or statistical models are not, explainable statistical models are not understandable by most people. So there is this information gap and explainability gap where it's not about this narrow world of deep learning models and making sure we unpack the black box. It's actually about making sure people understand what it is that's happening. And the second thing to think about is, well, what do we do with that transparency? Because transparency is absolutely useless without agency. So I can explain fully well what the process is that is deciding whether or not you should get a loan or buy a car or what I'm showing you. But if you as the end user have literally no agency over that outcome of what use is that explainability or transparency. So, and this ties back to the concept of governance, right? Governance is about creating agency and accountability. That is why people are so worried about artificial intelligence. There is an aspect of what if this thing makes a decision that I don't understand, but it is more, what if this thing makes a decision and I can't do anything about it? I don't know who to go to and how to get this thing fixed. And again, this is why governance is so critical to even the concepts of explainability and transparency.
Yeah, and I'll say explainability finds itself as one of the significant research thrusts for the Department of Defense. There's a program called DARPA's Explainable AI that aims to push the field forward in this area so that we can appropriately trust and effectively manage these systems. So sort of calibrate our trust appropriately. But to give the other side of the coin on that, I will say that humans are not that explainable.
We're very opaque.
Yeah, and so where you have highly trained special operators in any field, medical profession or what have you, they often operate in ways that are unexplainable, and they have hardwired intuitions from training, and they run a playbook, and they do what their sort of intuitions say. And post facto, they can rationalize why they did what they did, but really it was that kind of hardwired execution. So why I say this is that if you assume that there is some intrinsic error associated with AI systems, they work 49 out of 50 times, for example, or some intrinsic barrier to explainability, then it may force you to think more about the system design and the contexts in which you employ a system like that. Like, in what instances is it okay to have something that has that 49 out of 50 properties? And in what instances is it not okay?
I think the reaction that some companies have had to the controversy is to talk about or highlight the use of AI for good and the positive ways in which AI can improve society. Is this kind of a reaction to the negative things that have been happening, or is this really a message that is important for people to understand?
So I make an important distinction about what my job is, and people often think that my job is to do AI for good. It's not. So ethical AI is actually a separate thing from AI for good. And frankly, a lot of AI for good may not necessarily have ethical AI principles built into it. So AI for good is, at least in my view, a corporate social responsibility, really good way of harnessing this technology by the people in power and people enabled to utilize it in positive ways for communities that are maybe not able to utilize it. We have many examples at Accenture. We've built Alexa interview training bots for low-income communities and people who are not able to physically get to job training sites. We have in India built out a project called Drishti, which is something quite similar. It's basically a seeing eye for people who are blind. But that is very different from the responsible AI or ethical AI, where I think of the entire realm of AI solutions, commercial solutions, and even our AI for good solutions. And we think about how to ethically use the technology. And this may mean data privacy and security. This may mean how the information is being used. This may mean the assumptions that are being made about the data we've picked up. So while there is a very important aspect of AI for good, it's a different world than the ethics in AI discussion, would be my opinion.
I like that you make that distinction, and I agree with it. So there is a lot more activity in AI for good, and I applaud the notion of trying to ensure that the technology moves in a positive direction through action. But I would give two avenues for reflection on AI for good related issues. One is that we often instinctively try to find and tackle proximal problems and try to find products that can do X and have some concrete moment of good in the near term. This is especially true in Silicon Valley. This is sort of the way that I think a lot of tech companies think about instantiating AI for good. But if you believe that there are important structural dynamics at work, structural risks, things that social scientists would be familiar with, where lots of sort of good actions can, in aggregate, lead to very negative outcomes, then, which I do think is a critically important sort of risk to acknowledge here, then we need to figure out what AI for good looks like on an international scale, with many countries involved, in a well-resourced way, and for a long period of time. And that feels to me to be maybe a different form of AI for good entirely. It's much more comprehensive. And from there, I think that thought we could work back to some of our downstream, quicker actions. So I think one is it's quite vulnerable to short-termism. The second avenue for reflection I would give is how to do AI for good in the context, again, of market capitalism. Capitalism is an unparalleled vehicle for certain good things like meeting human needs or creating wealth or producing efficiency and jobs and things like that. And I think a narrow conception of capitalism would say that we prioritize shareholder value, and that may not always be aligned with AI for good. A slightly broader conception of capitalism would say that we could use the proceeds of capitalism to fund charitable work. We could carve out millions of dollars in a sort of philanthropic sense for AI for good. But I think a more expansive and maybe more useful notion of capitalism that includes broader set of stakeholders and prioritizes things like peace and stability, even from the standpoint of corporate actors. And this has happened in areas like environmental protection and things like this. That would be a much more interesting version of AI for good. You would have businesses being businesses and delivering on that sort of AI for good notion.
Technology doesn't have ethics. The people who build it and the people who use it have ethics. And so AI is no different. So as we contemplate, AI for good or the ethics of AI, I think we need to be looking to how do we put the frameworks in place around that technology that guide the individuals who build it, who use it, on what is an ethical use of AI or not. And so I think that's a challenge because that's going to be relative. It's going to be different for one country than it is for another country. It's going to be different from one company than it is going to be for another company. But I think without a basic set of principles and a framework around which we get people to think about the use of AI, we won't have the ethics question answered. I mean, we'll also have people who will always use AI in ways that we never intended it. As a person in the cybersecurity industry, we know that malware writers and hackers are leveraging AI to make their malware more effective. Poisoning of data sets is an area that we're extremely concerned about in terms of leveraging AI for those purposes. And so, having the good guys have a framework will be very useful, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we're also going to see the bad actors that we're trying to defend against often leverage this technologies for nefarious purposes.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's this world of unintended consequences, and like 99% of the things we will see, the ethical questions that arise in AI are about unintended consequences. People who meant well but didn't realize X, Y, Z. But you're absolutely right. We cannot ignore the value, and I mean that the negative value of bad actors and how they operate totally differently. So a lot of the responsible AI practice that I build is really about very similar to cybersecurity. It's damage mitigation. It's, well, something bad will happen, and just be prepared. And if I know anything about cybersecurity, that pretty much is the narrative. It's something bad will probably happen, so be prepared.
Or may already have happened, and you just don't know about it yet.
Right. So just make sure you have a crumple zone, a way of handling it, and don't just live in the world of, well, as long as we have the right amount of bumpers, we'll be fine, because that's not always going to be the case.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you mentioned that technology is neither good nor evil, and there's a quote that I forget who said it, but the quote is, "Technology is neither good nor evil, but neither is it neutral." And I would say that among the different categories of risk, this structural risk, the features of the technology overlaid on society and on political systems, there are some, in the case of AI, that systematically incentivize actions that will lead to broad harm. And just, I briefly alluded to this in the social science comment, but things like housing segregation and climate change are examples of these kinds of structural risks manifested. AI tends to create winner-take-all dynamics in markets. There is a risk of a race to the bottom in areas like AI safety research spending based on competitive pressures. And in the national security realm, there's a structural risk of sort of great power competition or these shrinking decision timelines. So, I think neither good nor bad, but not neutral, is a call to sort of think very critically about the structural risks that are present by virtue of or as features of the technology.
And I think also part of what you're alluding to are things like optimization functions. And often naively, the AI is programmed in a way that optimizes for a winner-take-all outcome. And you talked about sort of game theory earlier. I think a good approach, or a better approach, is think about it as, what if we optimize it such that we optimize for a collaboration function? But this is the AI space, the new iteration of artificial intelligence, is still so young and still so new at, I would say, like non-commercial outcomes, or outcomes that actually very much impact people's lives, not what sort of movie to market you with or socks to sell you, but ways that are very, very impactful that people haven't even had the chance to think through all of these yet. So because, when we think of marketing for media, et cetera, we're not sitting here thinking about collaboration versus winner take all. These are questions that come with time, and unfortunately, often come with making a very bad mistake.
But do you think that I think most people don't even realize that they're subject to AI algorithms today. So when you talk about marketing and figuring out what ads are going to show up on the side of my Facebook page, very definitely machine learning is involved in some of that. And so like, I know that my mother doesn't sit there and go like, wow, that's a really cool AI algorithm. They got that I need new socks, right? I mean, most Americans are clueless that they're being subject to these new technologies. And I think to some extent, helping to educate people and be transparent about the fact that these technologies are now influencing what they see every day, whether that be ads or news or whatever, is fairly important in ensuring that the neutral part, the good or bad or neutral, leans more toward the good side, because people are educated and aware. They know to think about it.
Yeah, it's massively important, absolutely. When we think about, you think about the filter bubble. The book, The Filter Bubble, was published a decade ago, like 10 years. So we have been steeped in a filter bubble. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept, it's the idea that we live in a media-curated world where recommendation systems, which are optimized to actually improve our number of clicks, show us media that we like. And as a result, often leads to ideological polarization on many different issues. So if it knows that I lean a particular way, guess what? It's not going to show me anything from the other side of the fence. And that's dangerous for two reasons. Number one, that I think I am right, that my viewpoint is right, and the world, quote, the world agrees with me. But number two, almost more dangerously, I think that any other viewpoint is literally crazy. That if somebody comes to me and says, actually, I think the opposite of you, I look at them like they're insane, because I know that the world agrees with me. And you're 100% correct. People don't realize to what extent they're already influenced by artificial intelligence. I think part of it's, because it's often dealt with in the public sphere as this futuristic technology. When I first started my job, I started off my talks by saying there are 3 things I don't talk about: Terminator, HAL, and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs saving the world. And sometimes I feel like I need to bring that slide back, because too many people think of AI as Sophia the robot, or it's this like physical manifestation. They don't think about the fact that their iPhone or their Android phone contains a massive amount of machine learning in all of the apps, and all of them are influencing you.
Well, it's sold to them as customization and convenience.
Yes. Well, that's the privacy
Customization
paradox.
and convenience. It's great for you, right? It's not AI. I'm actually influencing your thought going forward.
Right.
So as AI gets more powerful and the chips get more powerful and cloud computing becomes more prevalent, it feels like AI in general is going to become more powerful, giving companies more ability to collect data and do things with the data. So let's talk about regulation. We had an election the other day, and we now have a divided Congress, which suggests that it might be difficult to move things forward on the regulation front. But is AI a partisan issue?
And we talked a little bit about this earlier in the green room, and the optimist in me thinks that this may be one of the areas where we can make forward progress, regardless of partisanship. That if you're someone in Congress, you have constituents in your district back home that may very well be impacted by the integration of AI into organizations. So as positions that are easily automatable, whether that's fully automatable or partially automatable, become replaced with machines versus humans, people in your district will be without a job. And so can we begin now, instead of when that happens, before that happens, to contemplate legislation that would allow us to be prepared for worker displacement, retraining programs, things that could allow those people to land softly and continue to contribute to the economy in a positive way, independent of the fact that they lost their initial job, they now have a place in the new artificial intelligence order.
Absolutely, and the future of work is such a massive undertaking. It is what the World Economic Forum is very focused on. So globally, this is a narrative that transcends party, transcends government. It is a very, very real concern. One thing to think about is this is not just about factory jobs being automated by robots. Robotic process automation has already started to do that. It's been doing that for a while. This is actually about jobs that we consider white-collar jobs. In my opinion, the standard analyst, in other words, person who does their work via Excel and PowerPoint, is one of the most at-danger jobs, and that's most of Silicon Valley. So we're not just talking automation of bus drivers, truck drivers, et cetera, which is absolutely part of the question, but thinking about paralegals, thinking about analysts, and well-paid, highly educated jobs that also impact urban areas and possibly even more blue districts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I'd also point to, there are organizations doing a lot of really great work. One that I would highlight is the Markle Foundation. They're talking a lot about the future of work, and they've prepared so many talking points for the gubernatorial elections for politicians to understand this viewpoint. And we do have more and more interest in this coming out of DC. So.
I think, related to the partisan content of regulations, is an interesting question is, what kinds of regulations are we likely to see, and for what problems? Future of work is certainly one. And I think my hypothesis is that the types of regulation we see in the future won't look like regulation at all. They'll be more entrepreneurial, more technology forward, and there'll be things that either help address technological job displacement or help give government more information to make better decisions or help remove large classes of risk or create new markets. And I think examples of this are in AI, giving government better tools to sort of measure progress. I think that's an important area, something I'm seeing more focus on. Another is, if you take autonomous vehicles as a case study, repurposing government infrastructure to create sort of baseline and testing environments so that we can have safety protocols that are informed by these individual companies, but that involve government being very familiar with the state of the art and having a more active role in that. And the entrepreneurial side of it, or the side that has positive externalities, is this notion that government can do regulation like that in a way that unlocks innovation for companies that can't afford systems like that. Another example that I'll just throw out there is, of course, in the realm of data, where things like, sticking with autonomous cars, the accident data, the 1.2 million or more people who die each year on the roads in these relevant accidents, that could be shared, and today it isn't. Today it's sort of locked within individual companies, and it could be shared in a way that advances research, advances technology, with benefits accruing to all of us, to society. So these are examples of, I think, future regulatory templates that might be interesting to explore.
If I can add one more thing, I think the data question, or the data point, brings up another area where I think policy and legislation is going to need to kind of rise to the surface. As you contemplate the applications of AI, one of the reasons that it becomes so important is it gives us the capacity to parse through massive amounts of data that we couldn't get through before. And in doing that, we will be able to come to conclusions about specific individuals, specific markets, specific companies in a much more rapid way while the data is still fresh and could be leveraged in a way to take action. And so I think there is an angle of data protections, and I'm going to put air quotes around that because I don't know how far that goes or doesn't go. But I think AI raises the data protection question even closer to the top now as a result of the amount of data we'll be able to get through at any given point in time with the AI algorithms versus what we could do before with the previous technology that we had.
And the regulatory space is really interesting because it's really been heating up globally, like all around the world. Like the European Union has a High Commission on Ethics in AI, and people are calling for regulation. I mean, you had Microsoft literally say, hey, government, we want you to regulate facial recognition because we're not quite sure how to go about doing it. But the interesting, so sort of my prediction for the next year, we're seeing so much discussion about what new regulation do we need. And I'm starting to hear this bit of a wave of backlash to say, well, actually, we do have the regulations. We just need to figure out how to apply them. In other words, we don't necessarily need new laws about AI. We have laws that protect people, that protect us from, let's say, companies doing things to manipulate consumers, something like that. How do we then apply them intelligently? Which leads to kind of the second part of my prediction is that because there is a massive amount of information asymmetry, government has to get very smart very fast on these technologies. And the average congressperson or anybody working in any of the government offices needs to understand the role of artificial intelligence, these technologies, in ways that they don't today. And here's the problem with the information asymmetry. The very people they have to ask for that information are the very people they would ultimately end up regulating. And companies are not dumb. They realize they hold the power in this case. So it's a bit of a challenge to figure out how government can get skilled and work with companies in a way that leverages regulation such that innovation isn't hampered. Because to your point earlier, we do want a safe AI. We don't want innovation to be slowed down because we are in a bit of a global AI race. That is a very important and very careful line to toe.
I'm glad you brought up the law. Often solutions are discussed in sort of a way that's untethered from what I think is like the triad of sort of things that underpin a lot of societies, which is human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And the nice thing about mapping solutions to those or extending from those, thinking about, in the case of defense, how we would look at the Geneva Conventions, something like that, is that we get the benefit of decades or centuries or millennia of experience with these tensions. In the area of civil rights versus security, for example, these have been, our laws have been sort of texturized since Cicero and through, terrible phases of our country of Japanese internment and seizure of steel plants and Guantanamo and everything else. And to ignore the lessons of those things, to ignore a constitution that was sort of thought of with a lot of these challenging issues in mind would be folly. But there is something else, which is norms, that I think you see on top of laws. And I'm not a cybersecurity person, but I know that there's a reason why that community is not much more dangerous and why more dangerous things don't happen and why you have zero-day disclosures and things like this. And it's because folks are conditioned by a set of norms in the community that are not, they're not the law. Sometimes they are codified as such. In biology, you have Asilomar principles. And in AI, there's this movement right now of principles, like wherein employees can hold management accountable. And there's also educational work in this regard. So it feels like these norms are forming, and I can see some ways in which they need to form faster. Renaissances in technology impact around open source probably need to happen, for example. But I think that's an encouraging trend to observe.
Yeah, so two thoughts on what you just said. First, that is exactly how I'm building our tech solutions around identifying algorithmic bias. So Accenture came out with something called a fairness tool earlier this year. There are many ways in which one could identify data bias or adjust models for fairness. We relied on Briggs versus Duke Power Company. assessments of practices at your organization, and the concept of disparate impact, because there are so many ways I can statistically look at a model and some of them may be at odds with each other. How do I parse through which is of value and which I should be selling to a company? Legal grounding is absolutely a critical part of how we think about these things. And second, I do love that you're bringing up norms, because there has to be a conversation about the culture of tech and how it often, it has for so long embraced move fast and break things, right? Do now, apologize later. And now we're saying, actually, maybe sometimes we should not. And to an extent, we may be overcorrecting because we have sort of smashed everything for so long and disrupted everything from dog walking to vacuuming my house. Maybe we are in a stage of wanting to take a step back and say, let's be a little bit circumspect and be a little bit better about how we do things. And I think we are all almost in our adolescence of trying to figure out what that means. We don't have those norms quite yet.
And part of that has been because, yes, there's been technology we've introduced that could have done material harm, but people would have had to try to do that harm. Now we are developing technologies where people could do some pretty serious harm by accident. And I mean, not that you can't do harm by accident with a gun or a weapon or anything like that, but in the technology space where we're actually, well, I used the algorithm to do X and I did not foresee Y. I heard a great example on a presentation that I was watching where they said, if you tell an AI model to solve world hunger, one of the options is they just kill everybody. It's an option. It solves world hunger. None of us would consider that an acceptable outcome, right? And I would agree that there's probably some bad algorithms that were put in the first place. But that's an example of where the technology the intention was to do good. The technology's interpretation was, you asked me to solve a problem. I solved your problem.
Right. And then that goes back to the concept of optimization functions. Like that's all that is just a poorly optimized function. But you're right, empowering the average data scientist with the ability to think about that in that way. So think about not a winner-take-all scenario, but a collaborative scenario. How might, what might these unintended consequences be? Because of the rapid rise and democratization of this education, which is a very good thing, it has to go hand in hand with this sort of norms or idea of how we should or shouldn't be doing things. Absolutely.
Agreed.
I think we're out of time, but are there any quick questions? No? Well, thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much.
Before wrapping up today with 3 more interesting and difficult challenges, we're going to take one last brief break. We'll plan to reconvene in here in about 20 minutes.